Across the African continent, pre-colonial history reveals a wide range of social structures, cultural practices, and political systems. Within these societies, leaders shape the lives of their people through complex negotiations of diplomacy, trade, warfare, and spiritual legitimacy. The personal lives of these leaders, their relationships, companionships, and intimate bonds often mirrored the diversity found within their cultures. This episode examines the presence of same-sex partnerships within African royal courts before European colonization. These relationships were recorded by missionaries, traders, colonial officials, and early anthropologists, often described in language shaped by European cultural assumptions. However, when read alongside local oral histories and cultural contexts, these accounts reveal traditions of affection, companionship, and partnership between individuals of the same sex, including kings, queens, nobles, and royal attendants. The aim of this episode is not to impose modern categories onto the past, but to acknowledge the historical evidence showing that same-sex intimacy existed in royal environments and played meaningful social roles. These practices were interpreted within indigenous frameworks very different from the heteronormative and binary models later introduced by colonial systems. Recognizing these histories provides a fuller picture of African social structures and challenges the idea that queer relationships are foreign to the continent. In many African kingdoms, royal courts functioned as political, spiritual, and cultural hubs. They brought together nobles, advisors, warriors, attendants, spiritual practitioners, and domestic staff. The king or queen often maintained a large household with multiple wives, husbands, companions, or partners, depending on regional customs. Within these households, intimate bonds evolved naturally from shared responsibilities, proximity, and social expectations. It is important to understand that pre-colonial African marriage and partnership systems did not always align with modern Western notions of romance or sexuality. Many societies approached relationships through frameworks of lineage, alliance building, or spiritual responsibility. In such environments, same-sex intimacy could be integrated into social structures without contradiction. Rural households also provided more privacy and autonomy than ordinary societal settings. Kings and queens had the authority to shape their personal lives in ways that reflected both tradition and personal preference. As a result, evidence of same-sex companionship at the royal level is often more visible in historical records, particularly through European observers stationed at or near royal courts. One of the most frequently cited examples of same-sex intimacy within African royalty is Kabaka Mwanga II of Buganda, who ruled in the late 19th century. Much of what is known about his relationships comes from missionary accounts and colonial records, sources that reflect strong European biases. These accounts often describe Mwanga's same-sex intimacy using moralistic or condemnatory language. However, the underlying information provides valuable insight into the cultural landscape of the Buganda kingdom. Mwanga is reported to have had close relationships with his male pages and attendants. These young men served in the royal household, performing a range of duties that included personal companionship. Missionary records document tensions arising when some pages converted to Christianity and rejected roles that included intimate service to the king. In reaction, Mwanga saw their refusal as a challenge not only to his authority, but also to established court customs. Buganda oral history provides further context, showing that the relationships between kings and male pages had existed long before Mwanga's reign. These relationships were not considered unusual within Buganda's social system. Rather, they were viewed as part of the royal household structure, shaped by long-standing traditions in which companionship roles held political and personal significance. European misunderstanding of these practices contributed to their portrayal as evidence of moral corruption. It is crucial to distinguish between missionary interpretations and the Buganda cultural framework, which did not impose the same moral restrictions on same-sex intimacy. Mwanga's relationships reflect a broader history of royal social structures in which emotional and intimate bonds between men were part of palace life. In Central Africa, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, a renowned political strategist and military leader of the 17th century, provides another window into the complexities of royal intimacy. European accounts from Portuguese colonial officials describe Nzinga's household as including a group of male attendants who dressed in feminine attire and served her closely. Some records suggest that these attendants also acted as her consorts, although interpretations vary. Nzinga's court also reportedly included female companions who held positions of personal trust and closeness. While the precise nature of Nzinga's intimate relationships cannot be definitively reconstructed, the documentation shows that she redefined gender roles within her court and structured her personal life in ways that challenged European expectations. It is important to understand that Nzinga's adoption of masculine titles, attire, and military roles was consistent with Central African traditions, in which gender could be adjusted to reflect political responsibility or spiritual alignment. Her relationships, whether with men who adopted feminine roles or with women in her royal household, must be interpreted within the cultural context of her time, not through European binaries. Nzinga's life illustrates how royal intimacy in Africa intersected with political authority, spiritual legitimacy, and gender fluidity long before colonial constraints attempted to redefine those frameworks. In southern Africa, the reign queens of the Balabedu in present-day South Africa offer a striking example of female leadership intertwined with same-sex companionship. For centuries, the reign queen, or Mojiji, presided over a lineage of matrilineal rulers believed to control rainfall and ensure agricultural prosperity. Historical records and oral testimonies reveal that reign queens traditionally maintained a household composed exclusively of women. These women served roles that included political advisory positions, ritual assistance, and personal companionship. Some accounts indicate that the reign queens formed intimate relationships with members of their female household. The British colonial administration documented these relationships with fascination, noting that male involvement in the queen's domestic or romantic life was restricted because it was believed to interfere with her spiritual powers. The queen's partnerships with women were not concealed, nor were they considered inappropriate within the community's cosmological framework. The reign queens illustrate that same-sex companionship among women existed at the highest levels of African political leadership and was integrated into systems of governance, spirituality, and social structure. The Azande people of Central Africa, located across modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan, are well documented for their acceptance of male-male partnerships in both everyday and royal contexts. Early anthropologists, such as E. Evans Pritchard, recorded these practices in detail during the early 20th century. Azande kings and princes sometimes formed intimate partnerships with young male attendants or warriors. These relationships followed established social customs and were widely recognized within Azande society. Royal households included individuals who acted as both companions and partners to members of the royal family. It is essential to note that Azande society distinguished between youthful partnerships, which played specific social and mentorship roles, and later life marriages, which often involved women for lineage continuation. The presence of male-male relationships at the royal level demonstrates that such partnerships were culturally integrated and socially acceptable in pre-colonial Central Africa. These traditions stand in sharp contrast to the moral frameworks imposed during the colonial era, which interpreted these relationships through European legal and religious doctrines. Across the Sahel and northern regions of West and Central Africa, evidence of same-sex companionship exists within several royal and aristocratic households. Among the Hausa, the presence of young Daudu, Feminine men who performed important cultural, artistic, and domestic roles extended into the courts of nobles and kings. These individuals often formed close relationships with members of the aristocracy. Their roles were integrated into palace life and remained visible until colonial restrictions targeted them. In the Kanem-Bornu Empire, accounts describe intimate relationships between princes and male companions who traveled, lived, and trained with them. These relationships could be deeply affectionate and were sometimes ritualized or formalized. Among Fulani nobility, similar patterns are found. Historical accounts note that male companions held positions of trust and intimacy in aristocratic households. While European observers viewed these relationships through a moralizing lens, local traditions recognized them as part of established social structures. These examples across the Sahel demonstrate that same-sex companionship in royal environments was neither hidden nor stigmatized in many pre-colonial societies. Instead, it existed within broader cultural norms that valued emotional bonds, loyalty, and shared responsibilities. Female-female partnerships also appear in royal or aristocratic contexts across Africa. In Igbo society, practices such as female husband marriages, where a woman could take another woman as a wife for lineage continuation, extended to noblewomen as well. These relationships created legitimate household structures with shared responsibilities and, in some cases, personal intimacy. Among the Yoruba, queens and noblewomen sometimes engaged in woman-to-woman unions as part of lineage or economic systems. These relationships could involve close emotional and domestic partnerships and were recognized within the broader kinship framework. In parts of East Africa, aristocratic or noble women sometimes formed long-term partnerships with younger women who lived in their households. These relationships were incorporated into the structure of elite families, with social roles recognized by the community. These practices highlight the diversity of intimate relationships among Africa's royal and noble classes and challenge modern assumptions about the exclusivity of heterosexual marriage in African history. European colonizers and missionaries frequently misinterpreted or intentionally distorted the intimate relationships they observed in African royal courts. Their reports often framed same-sex companionship as evidence of moral disorder or cultural inferiority. These interpretations were rooted in Victorian-era beliefs that viewed heterosexual, binary relationships as the only acceptable form of intimacy. Colonial administrators used these interpretations to justify imposing strict sexual and gender norms. Missionaries condemned same-sex companionship as sinful and worked to reshape African institutions through Christian doctrine. Early historians often omitted or sanitized references to same-sex relationships in royal narratives, contributing to their erasure from public memory. In many cases, the colonial rewriting of history portrayed African leaders known for same-sex intimacy as corrupt or decadent, obscuring their political achievements and distorting their legacies. These distortions persist today, influencing how African societies interpret their own history. The belief that queer identity is foreign to Africa is rooted not in indigenous tradition, but in colonial narratives. Understanding the presence of same-sex relationships in African royal courts has important implications for modern discussions about identity, culture, and tradition. These histories demonstrate that same-sex intimacy existed at the highest levels of leadership, integrated into political, social, and spiritual systems. Recognizing these relationships does not diminish the significance of heterosexual partnerships in African societies, nor does it impose modern categories onto the past. Instead, it acknowledges the cultural diversity that existed long before European influence reshaped African norms. These histories provide evidence that queer identity has indigenous roots in Africa. Same-sex companionship was part of African social structures. Gender and sexuality were interpreted through broader cultural frameworks. and colonial narratives erased or distorted this complexity. By recovering these stories, Africans today can reclaim aspects of their heritage that were obscured under colonial rule. The presence of same-sex partnerships in African royal courts reflects a broader cultural landscape in which intimacy between individuals of the same sex existed within accepted social and political frameworks. These relationships were shaped by specific cultural contexts, and their significance extended beyond personal companionship into areas of governance, spiritual legitimacy, and household organization. Colonial authorities attempted to erase these histories by imposing European legal, religious, and moral standards. Yet the evidence that survives, through oral histories, indigenous records, and even colonial documentation, confirms that same-sex relationships among African rulers were part of the continent's social fabric long before colonial intrusion. As this series continues, we will extend the exploration of internet life in pre-colonial Africa by examining ordinary communities and everyday relationships, tracing how love, companionship, and gender diversity operated outside royal spheres.